Hello, everybody. I'm Brandie Nonnecke. I apologize for not being able to join you in person today. I am the director of the CITRIS Policy Lab, where we support interdisciplinary tech policy research and engagement with policymakers in both the public and private sector. I am on the faculty at the Goldman School of Public Policy, serving as an associate research professor, and I'm a faculty co-director at the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology at Berkeley Law. Today, I'm going to be talking about the laws, policies, and regulations shaping the future of AI. But before I get into that, one of the proudest roles I have is the host of a podcast and video series called Tech Hype, where we debunk misunderstandings around emerging technologies and the laws and policies that shape them. We hope you'll check out some of our episodes at techhype.org. The AI governance space has really been gaining momentum for about the past decade, and intergovernmental and international initiatives have played a very central role in shaping that strategy. OECD and its Global Partnership on AI established recommendations and principles, and the United States signed on to this. Now, also, the United Nations has been serving a very important coordinating function of bringing together nation states to talk about how do we best ensure that we are responsibly developing and deploying AI-enabled systems. The G7, also an important player here, getting that consensus among member countries on the responsible AI governance strategy. As we know, AI is not bounded by nation-state borders, but is operated and used internationally. Of course, we also have the AI Summit, the UK hosting the first, followed by another AI Summit hosted in Seoul, Korea, and upcoming in France will be the AI Action Summit to be held in early February 2025. These summits are an important convening as they bring together high-level policymakers, elected leaders, multi-stakeholder coordination around how do we best ensure that we are designing and deploying AI in a responsible manner. Now, national AI policies and strategies have definitely seen an uptick. There are about over 800 AI policy initiatives from 69 countries, as captured here. But what's really important is that we make sure that when we're talking about AI, we are talking about the same thing. And I know I'm talking to a room of people who are very interested in standards, so I can imagine that you are very concerned about definitions. How do you implement, operationalize those standards? You need clear definitions. And I'm going to quickly go over the definitions of AI as they have been placed into laws and by institutions. And the change in definitions is very important. Early on, the National AI Initiative Act of 2020 defined AI as a machine-based system that can, for a given set of human-defined objectives. Now, that's important to take stock of that. Make predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing real or virtual environments. Now, NIST, in its AI risk management framework, adjusted this definition a bit, and I'm sure many of you in the room already know why. They changed it to an AI system as an engineered or machine-based system that can, for a given set of objectives, right? We see human-defined has been removed. Now, that's important because the way machine learning has changed over time, we started to develop new methodologies like reinforcement learning, where a model is learning from itself to optimize an end function over time. It keeps about the same end of the definition, but that change from human-defined objectives to just objectives is an important change. Now, of course, the European Union passed the EU AI Act, the most comprehensive AI legislation to date. While it's passed in the European Union, it will have tremendous effect globally, right? Any company or entity wishing to utilize or sell, deploy its AI-enabled tool within the European market must be compliant. So definitions here are quite important. So let's just look at how they dealt with this objectives, human-defined, or what else. So they say an AI system operates with some levels of autonomy, and it's based on machine and or human-provided data and inputs, right? Inputs for objectives here. infers how to achieve a given set of objectives using machine learning, logic, knowledge-based approaches, and it generates outputs, including generative AI systems. So you can see the definition really changed in accordance with the development of these generative AI tools, and everybody's starting to adopt them. The European Union was trying to be very inclusive of all forms of AI and machine learning in their definition to make sure it was fit for purpose for AI today and tomorrow. Now, in the state of California, we recently passed a bill to establish a shared definition for the state in its legislation. And here again, we see sort of a condensed definition that was from the EU's definition, where we see it's an engineered or machine-based system that varies in its level of autonomy and that can, for explicit or implicit objectives, infer from that input on how to generate outputs that can influence physical or virtual environments. So a much more condensed version of the definition posed by the European Union, but very well aligned. Back to my earlier point about whether or not the European Union is affecting nation states beyond its borders, I think this is a very good example where we're seeing a pickup in similar definitions. Now, the EU passed the EU AI Act, but this isn't the only act that has some influence on AI systems. You can see here the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, Data Governance Act, all AI is all within scope of these laws. And then also the EU General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. At the federal and state level in the United States, we have definitely seen an uptick in the number of bills proposed. There are various trackers available. I will call out the one on the far left from CHI, the Center for Human Compatible AI at UC Berkeley, where they are documenting not only bills that have actually been signed into law, but they're also tracking executive orders, agency rulemaking, etc. At the very bottom, Tech Better, they're sort of the meta approach. Tech Better has compiled 16 of these such AI law trackers, and I really encourage you to go check it out. At the US federal landscape level, there has been definitely a momentum growing around how do we best ensure that we are responsibly developing and using AI. I've already talked about the United States adopting the OECD principles. And I also want to point out two bills that were passed into law. One in 2021, the National AI Initiative Act, which established the National AI Initiative Office, and also outlined that NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, would develop a framework for identifying and managing risks. Another, in 2022, the National AI Training Act. It requires employees of federal departments and agencies that engage with or use AI to understand its capabilities and appropriate risk management strategies. Now, in 2023, 2024 is when we see the big boom, and it's pretty obvious that's because of generative AI tools coming into the fore, people becoming more aware of AI. NIST released its AI risk management framework, which I will talk about in more detail in a bit. There are a couple others I'd really like to call out. The White House voluntary AI commitments, which were signed by many of the large AI companies, where they essentially said, we will do our best to ensure that we are taking appropriate risk management strategies and implementing transparency in our work. The other I want to point out is the executive order on AI, which really served as a catalyst for getting federal agencies and departments to develop guidance and best practices around addressing safety and security concerns, promoting innovation and competition within the U.S. market, and addressing issues of AI bias and infringement on civil rights. Now, in 2024, OMB issued its memo out of its order from the executive order to provide guidance on how do we advance governance, innovation, and risk management for agency use of AI. Now, quite recently, the Biden administration issued the memorandum on advancing the United States leadership in artificial intelligence, harnessing AI to fulfill national security objectives and foster the safety, security, and trustworthiness of AI. Now, we are sitting on really the eve of a new administration, a second Trump administration coming in January 2025. I'm currently writing an op-ed that will hopefully be published soon in Tech Policy Press on what does a federal AI strategy look like under a second Trump term. And if we look back at the first Trump term, I think a lot of the issues and points actually brought up in the Biden memo will be continued during the Trump administration. Issues around harnessing AI for national security, around AI in local manufacturing and supply chain resiliency, and then, of course, AI in the workforce. How do we best ensure that our workforce is equipped with the skills necessary to work in an AI-enabled workplace? Of course, the AI governance space does not operate outside of existing legal and regulatory oversight. Existing laws apply. You break those laws using an AI tool or a system, you hold liability for that. Now, federal agencies have really stepped up in their guidance. Of course, NIST with the AI risk management framework. Reminder to everybody, NIST does not have regulatory authority. It cannot force companies or other entities to implement its recommendations. It can only provide recommendations. Now, a cautious tale here, though, is that several bills have been introduced at the federal level and at the state level that would essentially require these companies to implement the NIST AI RMF. Second, the Federal Trade Commission has been a very powerful player. Through their authority via the FTC Act, they can go after companies and other entities if they are using AI in a way that promotes unfair or deceptive practices. At the state level, we're seeing bills popping up all the time. I'm going to cover really California in a bit more detail in a minute, but we see sort of these key themes developing, especially around data privacy, data rights, especially as they relate to automated decision systems. Definitely a concern around AI and elections, use of AI to generate outputs that could deceive or manipulate voters. Again, workforce development is a shared concern across the United States within states and at the federal level, and non-discrimination and auditing. In California, this slide just presents some of the bills that have been passed into law. So you can check those out, but one I will call out is SB 1047, which was California's really most contentious AI bill to date. It would have put in place requirements for developers of significantly advanced frontier models to implement risk assurance pre-deployment. In a minute, I will get a little bit more detail on this because I think with the new administration coming in, we might actually see a revised version of this bill proposed in the California legislature. Here are the 18 new California bills signed into law by Governor Newsom. Just going to highlight a few things here. Again, we're seeing elections, deepfakes being a key issue. But what's really important, I think, for this group around technical standards is around watermarking for AI-generated content. The state of California will have a law going into effect that will require generative AI developers to watermark their content so that consumers, receivers of that information will know that it was indeed AI-generated. Now, SB 1047, as I mentioned, very contentious. We covered it pre-amendment and post-amendments. Those videos are available on YouTube. Now, SB 1047 pre-amendments, there were some significant concerns about how to appropriately implement risk mitigation, risk assurance. We raised many of those issues in that episode. It's a short episode, about less than 10 minutes. And I was pleased to see that in the amendments, a lot of those issues were addressed, which we cover in the second video. Now, as many of you may recall, Governor Newsom received a letter from high-ranking members of Congress urging him to veto SB 1047. The rationale that the bill was too concerned about future existential risks and not about the current risks of AI tools and systems. Another, that it would affect the innovation of this transformative technology for the state of California and the economy. And third, really, if you read between the lines, especially in the letter from the high-ranking members of Congress, they really felt that this was an issue that should be addressed at the federal level rather than state by state. We'll see how this pans out with a new administration coming in and a Republican-controlled House and Senate. Of course, AI standards and guidelines are central to any responsible AI governance strategy. How do you actually operationalize this in practice? So I've included a few here. I'm sure all of you in the room are really deep into the standards, and I really appreciate all of your work helping to guide us in this really uncertain terrain. One thing I'm quite concerned about is, given this regulatory uncertainty of compliance, we're seeing this booming cottage industry of third-party AI auditors, evaluators, licensors, and certifiers. Now, something I'm really concerned about is that as we're waiting and working really diligently to establish those standards, especially standards that deal with the socio-technical challenges of AI, it's pretty uncertain how do you actually efficiently and adequately implement these evaluations. I was very pleased to see that Senator Hickenlooper in Congress introduced the VET AI Act, the Validation and Evaluation for Trustworthy AI. Now, the VET AI Act would mandate NIST to develop guidance on what does a robust third-party audit certification look like. I feel that this is a very, very important step moving forward so that we can better ensure that these audits are fit for purpose and are effective. I published a piece recently in Tech Policy Press if you'd like to go check it out. Of course, let's talk about how AI is actually defined by the field of computer science. I've gone over the definitions from laws and institutions. Now, we have obviously there's supervised versus unsupervised machine learning, deep learning, reinforcement learning. I'm going to get into that in a little bit more detail. All of these terms you see on the screen are terms that are often thrown around in discussions when we're talking about policy and governance and laws and regulations and overseeing AI. It's really important that we're all on the same page, that when we're talking about AI, we're talking about the same thing. From my own experience, when I'm engaging with individuals, especially policymakers, when I mention AI, their first thought is some type of Oracle tool, some chat GPT-like tool, Midjourney, that is essentially almost magic in its way of creating content. But that's a really bad position to be in, because not all AI, as all of you know, is generative AI. Our thought can't first go to generative AI. We cannot establish laws, regulations, or technical standards that are only focused on generative AI. It needs to be fit for purpose for all of the different forms of machine learning. One of the biggest challenges there when we think of everything as being generative AI, it's like that old phrase, if you walk around with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, if you're walking around just thinking about generative AI, then any technical or governance intervention will be framed in the way of addressing generative AI concerns. And that leaves us vulnerable to significant harm. So how do you actually navigate this uncertainty of AI governance right now? Well, we have to think about what are the components of responsible innovation, especially as we do not have established consensus on how to oversee these technologies through the technical mechanisms or governance mechanisms. So one thing we have to do is take stock of our values. And let me use the University of California as an example. The University of California was the first institution of higher education in the world to establish its own responsible AI governance strategy and principles. We ourselves were designing, deploying AI in our own services. We wanted to make sure that we were doing so in a way that aligned with the values of our organization. One of our values is non-discrimination. Thinking of that, you want to think, do I have a behavior or a strategy in place that enables me to operationalize my value of non-discrimination when I'm thinking about integrating AI-enabled technologies in my services? It's all about prioritization. If you jump to just adopting AI for your services without thinking through whether or not it aligns with your values and whether or not you have a strategy in place to operationalize those values, the implementation will fail. You have to prioritize values and encoding those values in your behaviors and practices through your responsible AI governance strategy before adoption. Here is a common risk-benefit management framework. In the interest of time, I'll just go over a couple. One of the ones that's most important to me is the legal risk-benefit management, ensuring that you are adhering to rights, your obligations, and compliance with legal and regulatory oversight. So let's go through just an example here of how do you actually operationalize those values in your behaviors and services. Common AI values are that AI should be ethical, that there's an element of social responsibility, that it is inclusive and reflective of the diversity of individuals who will be affected by that technology, that it is transparent and accountable, and that it also implements elements of sustainability. So we can think about the core values of your organization. And I'll give you all a moment to think here. I gave the example of the University of California where it was non-discrimination. So think about one of your core values. Maybe it's dealing with social responsibility or accountability or integrity. These are examples of how you can actually operationalize those values into a responsible AI governance strategy. So for example, if accountability and transparency is a core value of my organization, I'm going to emphasize public reporting and auditing of the use and performance of AI-enabled tools. NIST issued its AI risk management framework, which provides very helpful guidance on how to operationalize your values through a strategy. The 4 components are govern, map, measure, and manage risks. Their AI RMF playbook, I believe, is a very helpful resource of going through those steps. It gives you recommendations on things you should be considering when you are evaluating adoption, development, and use of AI. In collaboration with colleagues at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity at UC Berkeley, we developed a profile using the NIST AI Risk Management Framework for general purpose and foundation models. And this is available publicly. We go through the entire NIST AI Risk Management Framework and demonstrate what are the things you should be considering when you're evaluating the use of that tool in alignment with the NIST AI RMF. Again, in order to really navigate the uncertainty of AI governance right now, it's about ensuring that the values of your organization, which also includes, as I called out, those legal obligations, that's a value, it is operationalizing that through your strategy before you adopt AI into your services. And finally, thinking through some of the steps to ensure your organization can benefit from AI. You want to take stock of your organization's risk-benefit management. Are you thinking about this from a strategic perspective? Are you taking, I often see right now an opportunistic tendency where companies or public institutions are looking to adopt AI, especially generative AI, because of the great potential it can bring to increase efficiency, effectiveness, and potentially equity in your services. Now, if it's opportunistic, how are you ensuring that it is also legal, that you are upholding the rights of those you serve, that you are compliant with your obligations, and that you are following legal regulatory compliance mechanisms? It's critical that you all have a responsible AI governance strategy within your organization. Of course, at this stage, I do recommend implementation of risk and impact assessments. The NIST AI Risk Management Framework is a very good one to be using at this stage. And as I mentioned before, even though NIST does not have regulatory authority, we are seeing the NIST AI Risk Management Framework being encoded in law. And so I foresee this method being one that will be adopted by states, perhaps at the federal level, and we'll see a lot more entities implementing the NIST AI Risk Management Framework. Of course, I'd be amiss if I didn't recommend completing the IEEE certified training, which is a really important step to address my concern about providing that authenticity of whether or not a third-party audit or certification is robust enough. And last, if I could leave you all with very California terminology, please don't fall for FOMO, fear of missing out. Don't just jump to implementation of AI in your services without first encoding your values into a responsible AI governance strategy. Yeah, you will not be able to reap the great reward, the great benefit of that technology in your services if you skip those other steps, if you do not prioritize values and operationalizing them. And with that, I will leave my contact information up here. Again, I apologize for not being able to be there with you all in person, but I look forward to connecting with you all via email or social media. Thank you so much.